Chapter 6 of Sinister House by Leland Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Almost staggering through the darkness, I made my way back to the Ford. Annette was nervous and shaky. I startled her, coming up out of the darkness without any light. I hemmed and hawed, for I could not speak, and cranked the car, making up my mind to get the thing the 3 miles home on a flat tire. But Annette rebelled at that.
"Why didn't you get a light from the house as you started out to do?" she asked me with unmistakable irritation. "You're crazy to think of going home on a flat tire. I can't stand it. Why didn't you get the light? What's the matter with you?"
And then leaning closer to me in the darkness and almost whispering,
"What's the matter in the house?"
"Eric's come home," I replied.
"Well, what of that? What's the matter with him?"
"It's Julia."
"For heaven's sake, say something. What's wrong with Julia?"
But I couldn't explain. I hadn't the courage. The engine was running with a great racket, and the front lights shone far down the road, making bright whatever they touched upon, but leaving all else doubly black by contrast. A fitful wind was blowing, and I was more depressed in spirits than I had ever been before. Somehow, though, I had climbed into the seat and had grasped the safety lever. I could not bring myself to start the car. It was altogether a horrid couple of minutes. Naturally, Annette was mystified, but when I swore I would not go back to that house tonight, she almost lost her temper.
"What nonsense!" she exclaimed. "I won't ride home with you on a flat tire. If you can't mend it in the dark, I'll go and get a light myself. You might be a little more considerate, Pierre. Here I am shivering with the cold. Bobby needs his supper. I'm hungry, too, and yet you won't make a move to get us home. We'll all catch our deaths sitting here in this cold fog."
It did seem foolish, after all, and finally I went up the driveway again, stumbled along to the house, and knocked on the door. I heard a scream, faint and quickly choked, but none the less real. It was probably Julia, startled out of her self-control. To my surprise, Giles opened the door. Prompted by an instinctive feeling that I must bring cheerfulness into that house, I hailed him in a hearty voice, then called down anathema on tires, and demanded a light in tones that filled up the long rose-colored, shadowy hallway, and must have struck the ears of Eric and his bride pleasantly. Eric came out from the living room, and Julia followed him. He had honest, cordial words of welcome for me, but it was Julia who almost hysterically commanded me to stay and sup with them. I was taken off my guard. Through the door whence they had both issued, I caught a glimpse of the candlelit living room, of its odd, old-fashioned furniture, its small, deep-colored rugs, its dark hangings, and just a yellow flame or two of the fire burning in the little grate. But I was ill at ease. My nerves were shaking. I didn't like the house, warm as it felt and picturesque and cozy as it looked to my eyes. Yet, before I knew it, Julia had me by the arm and was leading me back down the driveway, pulling me along, in a great hurry to get to the Ford out in the blackness and commandeer Annette and Bobby. All the way she kept up a chattering about how cold it was, how hungry we must be, and how, in celebration of Eric's homecoming, we must stay and help them make merry. Under the run of this somewhat too urgent hospitality, I felt the strain of despair. I knew that Julia actually had need of us in that house tonight, for some terrible reason I could not hope to fathom. I made up my mind that as much as we should be acting our parts in ignorance, we would not go back on her. We could at least stand by, so I was cheerful with Annette, and enthusiastic for a good warm supper there and then. And Annette could not but accept this odd turn. We roused Bobby and went back to the house, Julia keeping up with my wife, the nervous talk that, on the way out, she had loosened on me. As we approached the door, left open, through which the faint rosy light came out into the dark, my boy began to twist and turn in my arms. Without his supper he was fretful and nervous, and he was frightened by the night, too. Indeed, as I carried him up the 2 steps of the porch, he began to kick me and to pound my shoulder with tightly clenched little fists. As yet he made no outcry, but I felt the wind gathering force in his little chest, and when we got inside the house and I set him down in the hall, there was something in the way he grabbed my legs and hid his face against them that made me fear for the worst. This was received in full measure when Eric, always up to that time a great favorite with him, tried playfully to catch him up in his arms. Bobby let out shriek after shriek, a sound too much of terror for me to think it an outburst of temper.
"Papa, Papa!" he screamed. "Take me away from him! Take me away!"
Eric was naturally amazed and hurt, and I was at a loss as to how to make things more pleasant. Nothing can make a child courteous if his instinct sets in the other direction. Bobby had no idea of concealing his sudden aversion to his beloved Uncle Eric. While Eric knelt down beside him to question the cause of this painful manifestation, Bobby only screamed the louder to Papa to keep Uncle Eric away.
"Keep him away from me! Keep him away! It hurts!"
"Is something hurting him?" Eric asked me quietly. "I guess he's just a tired, hungry boy," I answered. "What hurt you, my son? What hurt you?" Eric stood back against the wall, a tall, somber figure. As soon as he did this, the tension of Bobby's nerves seemed to be relaxed, though he gave me no answer to my question, but with a little shudder hugged my knees tighter. When I tried to take off my coat, we had another scene. Then Eric said in a low, troubled voice, "He seems to be frightened of me. For heaven's sake, Pierre, is there anything wrong about me tonight? I frightened Julia terribly. I can't get over it." "No wonder," I said without thinking of my words. "You came sneaking up to the window out of the dark." "Julia told you?" he asked, suggesting by his manner that Julia and I had a secret understanding out of which he was left. Julia had not, as you know, said a word of it to me. I am glad I told him frankly I had seen him myself, and that I had taken him for a prowler bent on mischief. "On mischief?" he cried. "On mischief? To Julia? Oh, my God! I heard her singing, and I wanted to feast my eyes on her without her knowing. But it wasn't that. For a long time after she recognized me, it was worse with her. A blind man could have felt it. She shuddered in my arms as if I were a thing of terror to her. She tried not to push me away." I had altogether too vivid an impression of what my own eyes had seen to enjoy this personal revelation. It was hard to give my voice an encouraging ring when I tried to assure him that he imagined too much. "That's nonsense," I said. "You're trying to tell me Julia was trying not to push you away? She must have been fooling." "Fooling?" he groaned. But I didn't let him go on. "And as for my son here," I added, "Annette's just read him that gruesome story about the Lorelei and has got him plumb scared. He's heard of the singing, you know, Julia's phrase, about the singing house, and when he heard Julia's voice out there in the dark, he probably thought there was a spellbinder here that wants to eat him. He does not know, Eric, old man, that only the ladies do such horrid things." Eric muttered and then cleared his throat. "There's something about me, Pierre. I know it. There's something about me. I used to think that Julia... I can feel it. Look at the child here, and has been trying to push Julia away." Though I laughed loudly at this notion, later, when we were all in the warm living room awaiting supper, I could see that it had got a hold on him. It must have been his own thought that held us all so strangely aloof from him. He might as well have stood within a ring of malevolence. His isolation was all but palpable, and in the midst of those who loved him too. Everybody in the room but Giles seemed screwed up to a high pitch, and laughed and talked with an unnatural animation, directing questions at Eric as if consciously trying to pierce whatever it was ringing him off from us. He habitually, so courteous, tried to send his answers back to us through the evil thing that set him apart. He tried at first, too, to walk among us, but whenever he came into our midst, Bobby's aversion broke out in frightened whimperings and agitation, so that, to smooth things over, Eric was compelled to stand outside the group. I can see him now, leaning against the frame of the window through which he had made his way in from the garden, his face taking on a serious, set look, quite different from the mobile sadness of his natural expression. The uneven light from the branch of candles over by that window now deepening, now relieving the shadows round his eyes, and, as his eyes grew hard, glinting back from them. It was with the expression of a man setting himself to make a bitter, deadly struggle that he watched Julia, playing like a gentle lunatic, with little Bobby standing between my knees. Poor Julia, slender and like a girl in her white dress, flitting through the warm room from one to the other of us. I could not bear to look at that delicate, gentle face, or into those clear gray eyes in which I had so lately seen the shadow of an unspeakable horror. My heart ached for her, though I hardly knew why. Bobby's behavior to her husband must have been like a knife thrust in her breast, and she set herself to winning the little fellow from his fear, for her husband's sake, I do not doubt. Laughing with unnatural eagerness, trembling and nervous, always playing bravely to simulate gaiety, though she could not hide her agitation, she threw herself lightly on the floor beside me and began quizzing him, patting his hands, mocking him, challenging him, until she brought a smile to his little face. Annette, who, I could see, was made very uncomfortable by the rudeness of her only son, stood over the three of us and laughed and coaxed with us. Well, it may have been a pretty scene to one looking in from the outside, but I was anything but happy. Julia's tenseness was harrowing, and her determination to win Bobby over and walk him right up to Eric somehow threw me into the state of a too anxious onlooker at a desperately vital game. I found myself, as it were, pressing my little son away from me to her, and holding my breath over every inch she drew him from the protection of my knees. It was a slow and nerve-wracking business. She drew him truly only an inch or two at a time, and always he would have fallen back against me had I not kept my hands ready to block the way of his retreat. Was it cruel to the child? We did not then know what evil Julia, single-handed, was fighting. One look at her face would have aroused your sympathy. We did not mean to offer my boy as a... The thought is too terrible. I happened to glance towards Eric. God knows he was susceptible. Unable to bear the sight of this wrestle of wills to force a way to him, he had turned his face from us, and, still by the window, was looking fixedly out upon the lawn. Suddenly, and I know of no reason why it should have been so, at that moment it flashed upon me that he was the goat in all this. He was the unfortunate object of the malevolence I had felt about the place. This came to me very clearly. Whatever the evil was, it was attempting to blockade him, to shut him from his wife, his friends, from the tenderness on which alone he could thrive. Here, in his own house, just returned from an absence, he stood isolated, the beings who loved him fended from him by a virulent, powerful evil spirit. I had seen inflexible and bitter determination on his face. He could fight for himself, could protect himself. But this thing was trying to attack us. Julia, Bobby, me, even Annette. It was jabbing us, thrusting us back from him, and he had just begun to know it, or to feel it. I had a fit of almost fury. I jumped from my chair. Julia lost her balance and fell on her side away from me. I strode towards Eric, grabbing my boy by the arm and dragging him along with me clear of the floor. I said to him sharply, "No more of this nonsense. You shall kiss your Uncle Eric and tell him you are sorry for making such a rumpus. Stop your yelling." Heavens, how he yelled! Not a scene to soothe a mother's heart. Eric turned suddenly towards us and raised his clenched fists above his head. His face was distorted, but it was neither his gesture, which, God knows, was of desperate rage against some evil thing, not against Bobby and me, nor the frightful look on his face, which stopped me dead short. I saw... Wait a moment, my blood turns cold as I write. I wish to set down precisely every detail as I can remember. I must have been holding Bobby well off the ground, for as my hand that held him went suddenly powerless, I heard him fall in a heap on the floor, heard the thwack of his little boots. His yelling was hushed to silence, and then I heard... No, that thing was... I was standing in the middle of the room, about 7 feet from Eric. He was still over against the curtains by the window, the candles at his right, casting a dancing light upon his ashen, distorted face and his wild arms. Mind you, this was all in a second or two. Bobby lay crumpled at my feet. The two women were behind me, and Giles, in an attitude of lounging from which my extraordinary behavior was to make him spring, was on a sofa pulled out about 3 feet from the wall to my left, leaving a freeway along that wall. Stepping from in front of Eric, against whom it must have been invisible, a vague shape passed like a blur across the candlelight, and then transparent, yet visible in its whole length against the dark hangings of the wall, it walked along the side of the room, behind Giles, and out the door into the dim rose-colored hallway. I say it walked, but really it moved in some half-human, half-fiendish gait. Slowly, yet in springs. It was the shape of a tall woman. Though its eyes had no substance, they had form, dreadfully flat, and color, a washed-out chalky blue. They were of the kind that in a living, warm body never revolve in their sockets, the gaze of which is directed by a turn of the whole head. And as this thing passed along the wall, its insubstantial head was turned at me, so that I was subjected to a lidless stare of incredibly sinister malice. I felt frozen. I believe I saw this thing. I believe that in a horrible amazement I watched it every inch of its way till it turned down the hall corridor in the direction of the dining room. It made absolutely no sound in its passage, but what should have been its feet, I saw movement under its skirt-like draperies, touched the floor in time with the beat of Julia's hands. I could not see Julia, but I believe that at that moment she was lying prone on the floor, slowly beating her hands on the rug, each hand alternately. I cannot remember more details. Giles sprang up and put an end to what I am willing you should call my fit by roaring at, "What the devil are you looking at?" There was something in his voice that stilled every movement in the room. My hand, which I had raised to brush a dank mist from before my eyes, was arrested halfway to my face. I believe the candle flames burned suddenly straight into the air without a tremor, but that must have been because the uneasy wind had ceased for an instant to blow in through the window, still ajar behind Eric. There was a complete silence, too. My extraordinary seizure and Giles' sharp cry probably frightened everybody. I know Bobby made not even a whimper. And Julia's monotonous drumming ceased. We were all spellbound in diverse, strained attitudes. There came an answer to Giles' imperious question. I can't tell you how or whence it came. Giles had asked me what I was looking at. In the silence which followed his sharp question, a name echoed in my brain. Probably I did not hear it. I dare say whatever vibration made the impression of that name in my brain had not rattled the little bones in my inner ear. And that is the way they tell us we receive impressions of sound. Maybe it wasn't earthly sound. At any rate, the name was distinct. It was Snart, and it was followed by a disagreeable sound between a chuckle and a whine. I think my son received the same impression, for through his body huddled against my feet I felt a shudder pass. But I never spoke to him about that night. I've protected him from any mention of it, and I faithfully and seriously tried to protect his mind from every hint of weirdness and horror whatsoever. Call it the rattle of leaves on the stark bushes outside the window. Call it the moan of the wind, the grating of a hinge somewhere in the remoter quarters of the house. Whatever it was, I was so conscious of its meaning that I asked. Annette told me afterwards that I spoke like a man in a dream, but I know I had not been dreaming. Who said that?
Who said what?
Giles roared at me. Who said that name?
Who said what name? Are you crazy?
Crazy? Was I crazy? I was to be assured later by the one other person in the room who was aware of what I had passed through that I was not crazy. However, I should have come out with the name I had heard had not Annette cried passionately,
"Mr. Greer, don't look like that."
Then it was I realized that I had been staring at the wall, say, and that there were other human beings in the room beside me. I turned to look at Eric, and I shall never forget the sight of his face. Whiter than death, and gnarled and twisted, his pose was inhuman, like that of a savage beast. One after the other of us, he fixed with his eyes, if one can call eyes the deep black holes beneath his brows behind which, I now know, there must at that moment when he was so beset have burned a feeling too terribly profound to show the faintest glow. I wonder would it have been better for that unhappy man had I come out with the ghastly name, as I had been on the point of doing. Annette touched me on the arm. Neither she nor I can remember whether she said anything to me or not. I stooped down and picked up my son. Giles was lending a hand to Julia, and for an instant it struck me as funny, this restoration, this setting up of what had been knocked down by some unnatural passer-by. Maybe I should have laughed aloud but for Eric's face. Annette's cry had not changed it. For months she had called him Eric. Tonight she had called out to Mr. Greer. Was he then a stranger to us all at once? I never felt closer to him. I never before wished so ardently to befriend a fellow being. You see, it was that sudden inspiration I had had, the sudden revelation that had set me to go up to Eric with my boy, just before the ghost woman had appeared. A flash of understanding that all the evil about the place was directed at him. While it attacked Julia, Bobby, and me, who were most fond of him, in that mysterious way the effect of which was to keep us from him, I knew that its ultimate victim was Eric himself. I have since reasoned about what I felt vaguely that night. That Eric, of all men, was most sensitive to such a form of persecution. Not only that, but also that he was impregnable to every other sort of malevolent attack. That's what Giles meant by tempered and white-hot resentment, I now know. Meanwhile, with my boy held tightly in my arms and my anxious wife at my elbow, I had Eric's face always before me. The uneasy wind came in through the window again and bent the candle flames. I could not bear it any longer. I handed my son to his mother. The little fellow at first would not let me go, clung tightly to me, and hid his face against my coat. But when I said, "Mother wants you," he turned quickly to her, where she stood close beside me, reached out his arms, locked them round her neck like a trap, and thus the transfer was done. Then I walked up to Eric and clapped him on the shoulder. Automatically, like all healthy, normal beings, I deny the existence of horror. I said the thing most natural for me to say. "Eric, my friend," I said, "brace up. You look as if you'd seen a ghost." The impression in my mind of what I had myself seen and heard was already laid over with my restored habit of thought. Eric replied to me in a low voice. "I saw nothing, Pierre. Not I, but you heard a name. What was it?" As automatically as a swimmer throws out his arms when he finds himself in deep water, I said, "Nonsense. It was my kids whimpering." Why did I do that? Why? You know I believe I heard a name. I could never forget how I heard that name, or what it was. I had already made a scene in the drawing room about it. Yet, to Eric, I denied that I had heard it. Denied there was a name. Said, "Nonsense, it was my kids whimpering." "Oh, no," Eric said. "Oh, no." What would that name have meant to Eric? It was just that I feared, yes, instinctively feared, to know. His jaw was set and his lips so tightly closed that all the red had gone out of them. Yet I could not help feeling that his will was engaged with some purpose other than self-control or self-adjustment, because I never stood by a man so rigidly under discipline of himself. Though my hand was on his shoulder, I was as remote from him as one is from a lion at the zoo, whose terrible fixed eyes and stare cannot be diverted or altered by any human trick to catch attention. If Eric had seen nothing, and had heard nothing, then he scented something, had a sense of it somehow, and he had become entirely concentrated, entirely instinct. Giles once said to me as we were talking over this affair later, that hate is the most absorbing passion. He went on at a great rate about man's reactions to things that hurt him mortally, that threaten to spoil what is dear to him, or to take something away from him that is necessary, not only to his body, but to what Giles called his soul as well. The instinct for self-preservation, he said, is the seat of hatred. But you should have heard Giles define self. I myself have never felt malignant hatred. I suppose I have never been threatened, that nothing has ever attacked with intent to murder the core of me, my heart of hearts, or what is dear and necessary to it. I could not, if I would, crank up an essay on hatred. To hate entirely, instinctively, and with perfect concentration. Not even Giles had known what it was to do that. But Eric had. There's Giles's white-hot resentment for you, in stronger words. That's what I began to feel in Eric as I stood beside him that night. A hatred within him, distorting his face and screwing him up into a state of concentrated attention. You remember I've told you that he always had seemed alert as against an inexorable hostility, making him to my imagination like lions I'd clapped my hands at in the Bronx and never made wink an eyelid. Just that, a terrific and an undying hatred. Well, I went on saying nonsense with a more and more absurdly nice-kitty air. Twice he started to speak, but he only opened his lips enough to take in a breath through his teeth. His jaw remained set. When he did speak at last, I know he did not think of my being near to hear him, but I heard. "I begin to suspect," he said. "She said she would, always. It's fiendish, but she would if she could." Then he darted a look at me, and I just babbled something as if I had not heard him at all. Suddenly the whole expression of his face changed to one of what the novelists call infinite longing. I did not need to turn round to know that Julia was coming up to him. Her eyes were shining, and I thought she was laughing happily. It made me feel good, just as if nothing had happened. She reached one hand up to Eric's shoulder and took me with the other, and then said, "What are you two men talking about so seriously here by yourselves? Supper is ready. You, Pierre, must be starved." She looked at me perfectly frankly. I was astounded. In spite of myself, I began to feel that my mind was queer, that I had imagined the whole thing. I felt dazed, and also silly. End of chapter 6.